Good day. In my last programme, I touched upon the attack on the Crimean bridge and some of the international reaction to it, that when I made the programme, it was still difficult to get a full picture of what exactly had happened. Well, we now have a much more detailed picture, and we can say a number of things. Firstly, it does seem as if the attack was indeed carried out through some kind of explosive device. Apparently 100 to 120 kilos of TNT worth, an explosive device which was in a truck which was seeking to cross over the bridge. The driver of the truck, who is an Azerbaijani national, is apparently not suspected of having any knowledge or involvement in the explosion. He was apparently an innocent dupe, or one must presume the Ukrainian secret services. A fact, by the way, which I find disturbing and which shows that an entirely innocent man, a national of a country that is not involved in this war, was involved and manipulated and ultimately killed in order to achieve a particular result in connection with this bridge. I've noticed no discussion of this fact, by the way, in Western media coverage of this episode, which I'm going to come to shortly. Anyway, the net effect of the explosion was that it does seem to have done significant damage to one of the two roadways of the bridge, but that it didn't affect the structural integrity of the bridge itself. And importantly, it doesn't seem to have affected railway traffic across the bridge to any significant degree. Though the explosion did set fire to apparently 6 tanks of gasoline that were in a train that was crossing the bridge. The damage to the railway part of the bridge was superficial, and railway traffic across the bridge resumed within a few hours. In addition, the other roadway to the bridge was also unaffected, and apparently road traffic is now crossing the bridge on that part of the roadway, though obviously there are delays since one roadway of the two that make up the bridge has been badly damaged. It's estimated that the repairs to the damaged roadway will take something like 40 days. Now that, it seems to me, is an accurate summary of where we are with the damage to this particular bridge. I've discussed many times the great difficulty of destroying these big, large, heavily engineered, over-engineered, if you like, pieces of infrastructure like dams and bridges over large distances, the Dnieper River, the Crimean bridge being another case in point. And I've always suggested that doing damage to these huge works of infrastructure is far more difficult than some people appear to understand. I mean, the Antonovsky Bridge in Kherson, which has been the target of repeated missile strikes by Ukraine, is still standing, even if the road surface has now been damaged and causing road traffic across that particular bridge to stop. But everybody believes correctly, that if these missile attacks eventually end, then it will be possible to bring the Antonovsky Bridge back into operation with repairs that would take perhaps a couple of weeks. And the same is true, perhaps even more true, of the Crimean Bridge. And I would add that just as the railway bridge across the dam of the Novaya Kakhovka, which crosses over the Dnieper River, has never, it seems, been seriously affected by the various Ukrainian missile strikes, so it has proved with the railway bridge that is part of the Crimean bridge complex. And as I've also discussed in many programs, it is over these railway bridges that the Russian military will be sending the vast bulk of its supplies. Now, that, as I said, is an accurate summary of where we are with this attack. It's not the impression, however, that you would get from following the Western media. I've been reading various Western media accounts of the attack on the bridge, of the Crimean bridge. I've been reading reports about how the bridge has collapsed, how it has been blown up, how it has fallen, none of which, as we can see, is true. If you read these articles carefully, if you read through them, if you go past the headlines which give the impression of the bridge having entirely collapsed, if you drill through into the articles, you will find squirreled away in these long articles sentences which appear to acknowledge that some traffic is moving across the bridge, though it doesn't admit that railway traffic has now apparently resumed at its previous level, and that there is now considerable road traffic crossing the bridge as well. Now, I have to say, this is deeply misleading. In fact, it is so misleading that I have to question the integrity of the reporting which is involved. Certainly, this sabotage on the bridge has been an embarrassment for the Russians. A truck laden with explosives was able to penetrate the security barriers and cause significant damage to the bridge. And of course, there are political repercussions from an attack of this nature on a piece of infrastructure which is very symbolic of Crimea's unification with Russia. And this has provoked angry commentary on Russian social media. But reporting all of those things would be true and justified, but giving the impression that the entire bridge has collapsed or has been blown up, as headlines do and articles do and photographs attached to these articles also do, is, as I said, positively misleading. It is misleading to the point of giving Western viewers a completely false picture. And I'm afraid this has been something which has been giving me growing concern about the totality of Western media coverage of this war. There's been no reference, as I said, to the fact that an innocent man, a completely innocent man, the national of a country not involved in the war, somebody from Azerbaijan, seems to have been tricked into carrying a lorry across a bridge laden with explosives. One assumes, by the way, that somewhere monitoring the movement of this lorry, there was some Ukrainian operatives, and that they were able to ignite this lorry with some kind of remote device. I'm not going to speculate about that. But there's been no coverage of that as far as I can see in the Western media, though I think there should have been. And the impression about the damage that's been done to the bridge is straightforwardly and completely wrong. Now, I don't know why this kind of information or incorrect information is being given. I understand that the Western media overwhelmingly and massively supports Ukraine, but this is a case, it seems to me, when the Western public, at least the British and American public, are being given an entirely false account of what has actually happened. I've seen Russian commentaries, by the way, which go further and further in the opposite direction. They say that this attempt to sabotage the bridge was a failure, that the intention was to cause much more damage to the bridge than was the case, and that the lorry was exploded when it was in the wrong position, and that if it had reached the top arch of the bridge, more damage would have been done, or if it had been closer to the railway, more damage would also have been done. I think all that speculation, by the way, is groundless. I suspect that whoever planned this operation probably wasn't thinking as far as these Russian commentators appear to think. I'm going to say straightforwardly, I think, again, maybe there is a dearth of people getting proper advice from civil engineers, the sort of people who build these bridges. I say that because, just to give an example, a couple of weeks ago, President Zelensky ordered a major purge of Ukraine's intelligence and security agencies, and complained angrily that no step had been taken during the events in March to blow up the bridges over the Dnieper River in the Kherson area, meaning, I presume, the Antonovsky Bridge and the bridges over the Novaya Kakhovka Dam, and that this supposedly made it possible for the Russians to advance and take Kherson city. Well, all I will say about that is that, yet again, it seems to me that Zelensky, if that is what he truly believes or believed at the time, completely underestimated how difficult it is to destroy bridges. Now, I am not saying, obviously, that bridges like the Novaya Kakhovka Dam Bridge and the Antonovsky Bridge cannot be destroyed by explosive devices planted by military engineers. Of course they can be. But this is a very complex operation requiring a lot of explosive and requiring expert engineers who know and understand how to destroy these sort of major pieces of infrastructure. It's not something that any sapper unit of a Ukrainian in the Ukrainian military would be able to do. It would require planning, it would require organization, it would require the gathering of the right types of explosives and the right quantities of explosives. And that's not an easy thing to do. And in the chaotic circumstances in March, when Ukrainian resistance in southern Ukraine was collapsing and the Russians were conducting a whirlwind advance, I think it's completely unsurprising that the bridges, the Novaya Kakhovka Dam Bridge and the Antonovsky Bridge, were not destroyed. So that's what I wanted to say about this. I think people do misunderstand how complex an operation destroying bridges is. Now, same applies to all these stories that one hears about the Russians launching massive acts of retaliation to destroy the other Ukrainian bridges across the Dnieper River. And I've seen some suggestions, by the way, that the Russians might actually use tactical nuclear weapons to destroy these bridges, which I think is a fantastic idea and one that should never be entertained or discussed in the kind of way that I've seen it being discussed. Again, it's not as straightforward to destroy these bridges, these Ukrainian bridges, these bridges across the Dnieper, the bridges that Ukraine is using, as some people imagine. I did say that I do think that the Russians do possess these capabilities. I think that these huge missiles like the Kh-22 and 23 and 32, which are operated by Russia's Tupolev 22M3 bombers, might be capable of this, and perhaps also the Kinzhal hypersonic missiles. But this would be a major operation. Now, interestingly enough, we've had some news about this, which is that it seems that Ukraine tried to repeat in an airfield in central Russia the same kind of operation that it successfully carried out back in August against a military airfield in Crimea. It tried to send a drone with explosive devices over this airfield with a plan of dropping bombs on some location on the airfield and causing damage to the airfield. Well, on this occasion, the Russians detected the drone and it was shot down. I'm guessing, that the Russians have tightened security around their airfields following that event in Crimea back in August. But one effect of this, one consequence of this, is that satellite pictures have been appearing of the sort of aircraft that are concentrated on this particular airfield. And sure enough, there were 20 Tupolev 22M3 bombers there. And on some of them, you could actually see these giant Kh-22 missiles. And there were also MiG-31s there on this airfield. And they are, of course, the aircraft, the carrier aircraft for the Kinzhal hypersonic missiles. Perhaps this is a strike group that might be intended at some point to launch those attacks on the bridges. Just a guess, we'll just have to wait and see. But anyway, destroying bridges, to repeat again, is not a simple affair. Perhaps some journalists in Western newspapers and media outlets think so. Maybe they choose to ignore information that's coming out of Russia. Maybe they see these pictures of fires on trains and can't quite believe that a fire and an explosion on this scale could do such limited damage to a bridge. But all I will say about that is that I make an effort on these kind of programs to check out the actual news. I've discussed questions like the destruction of bridges with actual engineers, the kind of people who actually build bridges. I've done that in the past, by the way, not recently. And there's no reason why Western media outlets can't do the same thing. So I don't think there's any excuse for the kind of reporting that we've just seen from them. And the same, by the way, applies to an even greater extent for me in relation to some other things that Western media outlets have been reporting. Now, over the last couple of hours, there's been a further rush of atrocity claims. I'm not going to go into details on certain Russian news sites. These are atrocities which are claimed that the Ukrainians have committed. I have an iron rule, which is that I discuss these atrocity claims that each side makes about the other as little as possible. I do expect or others to do so. I come back to what I've said many times, that these sort of claims really require a proper investigation, something which unfortunately over the course of this war never happens. But we have had, over the last couple of days, some rather interesting admissions. This is in the Western media. Firstly, there was a report, I believe in the New York Times, which says that the United States government has now essentially come to the same view as the Russian government, which is that the recent assassination in Russia of Daria Dugina, the daughter of Alexander Dugin, the Russian political scientist and philosopher, was indeed the work of Ukraine's special services and was actually ordered by members of the Ukrainian government, that it was careful not to say which members. And again, this fact, which led to the murder of an innocent woman, apparently killed in this way by mistake. Target was her father, who, whatever one's views, also doesn't seem to have been a legitimate target in my eyes. Anyway, this has received an astonishing lack of reporting, at least in the British media which I read. But even more disturbing was an article in the Daily Mail which reported that there have been revenge killings in Ukraine of people who are civilians, who are believed by some people in Ukraine to have collaborated with the Russians in some way. And I found the article in the Daily Mail disturbing because it didn't seem to me that it discussed this topic in the right way. It was reporting that revenge killings were taking place, but there seemed to be an extraordinary dearth of condemnation of the fact. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say. Let me repeat it again, say it again. Revenge killings are straightforward murder, and they should not be sugar-coated, whichever side carries them out. Now, there's also, I should say today, as of the time of making of this program, a really rather extraordinary editorial in The Guardian, or I say The Guardian, but actually it's the Sunday edition of The Guardian, The Observer, which has published this editorial, but of course it takes the same militantly pro-Ukrainian view as The Guardian itself does. In fact, perhaps it goes even further than this. But the interesting thing about this editorial is that it discusses the damage to global institutions, to the fabric of society, to the fabric of global society that the war is causing. And it says things like this. I'm not going to read the whole article, and I'm straightforwardly saying I'm being very selective about this article in respect of what I'm reading in it. But it makes points like this. A conflict at the edge of Europe has gone on to shatter the authority of the United Nations, undermine the climate change fight, inflate global food prices, create a huge refugee emergency, bolster Europe's and America's far right, spark cultural and sports boycotts, and harm international cooperation as far away as outer space. Shockwaves from Putin's war are rocking global energy supplies and markets in previously unimagined ways. Last week's decision by OPEC plus Russia to cut global oil production could greatly exacerbate Europe's problems this winter, causing serious hardship. Yet EU attempts to cap gas and oil prices are bedeviled by national differences. The geopolitical impact of OPEC's decision may be more momentous still. A political cost to himself, Biden had personally appealed to Saudi Arabia and other Gulf exporters to boost output. Now the US angrily accuses OPEC of backing Russia's war. Most of its members are supposedly Western allies. Have they switched sides? If that is the case, it would exacerbate another troubling system of Putin plague. Horrible expression. I'll continue. The separating out of leading countries into two opposing camps. In one corner, China and India, note India, which continue to buy Russian oil and refuse to impose sanctions, plus like-minded authoritarian regimes such as Iran. In the other corner, the US, UK, other members of the G7 and the EU. In this developing confrontation, much more is at stake than Ukraine's sovereignty. On life support, it seems, is the entire post-war consensus underpinning global security, nuclear non-proliferation, free trade, and international law. And it goes on to say that the war's spreading economic impact sickens the world as global recession beckons, stock market exchanges turn bearish, inflation and debt levels rise, Ukraine's grain exports are threatened by a resumed Black Sea blockade. I've seen no evidence of that, by the way. And climate targets are jettisoned wholesale amid a panicky stampede back to fossil fuels. As for Kiev, it is running out of money. The US has pledged $1.5 billion a month in non-military aid, but the IMF calculates that Ukraine needs $5 billion a month just to keep its economy going. Washington Kiev accused the EU of failing to do its bit of $9 billion euros promised by Brussels. In May, only $1 billion has been paid out. And then it goes on to say, no disagreements over sanctions and military supplies to Ukraine also strain internal EU relations and transatlantic ties. Once again, the US is in the lead, providing $16.8 billion in security assistance so far. In contrast, France and Germany are accused of holding back vital weaponry. Pro-Russia Hungary, meanwhile, actively sabotages EU unity. So a cascade of failure, but no admission anywhere that some of these problems, in fact, many of these problems, in fact, this entire crisis, which is blamed by The Guardian exclusively on Putin himself, is to a huge extent self-created. The fact is, there's been no serious attempt, no real attempt at all to find a diplomatic solution to this problem. When a diplomatic solution appeared to be within sight back in March, following the Istanbul agreements, Britain, with the enthusiastic support of the British media, British government, Boris Johnson, with the enthusiastic support of the British media, including, of course, The Guardian, sabotaged that that prospective diplomatic settlement. There's no plan, no idea, no concept of what to do here to resolve these cascading problems that The Guardian itself admits to and which are getting worse. In fact, the last paragraph says the following: if the Putin plague is ever to be eradicated, if the war is ever to end, such developments inside Russia, presaging a change of leadership, full military withdrawal from Ukraine and a fresh start, represent the best hope of the cure. In other words, things are getting worse. So what do? We don't look for a solution. We don't look for a way out, except we double down trying to achieve regime change in Russia. And if that doesn't happen, well, all of these problems will continue to get worse. And what we see supposedly is that the entire post-war consensus, that's The Guardian's own words, which is now on life support, will presumably be sacrificed and will collapse as part of this extraordinary drive to achieve regime change in Russia, one which, as The Guardian in effect admits, China, India, the oil producers, most of the world don't support. Well, that's the media. I mean, I have to say, that's the media, at least in Britain, and indeed in the entire Anglo-American world, the mainstream media, I have to say that I do wonder whether there are perhaps people within Western governments who are starting to think other ways. Now, in my last video, I discussed further the utterly bizarre and, in my opinion, deeply troubling nuclear Armageddon comments which President Biden has recently made over the course of a Democratic Party fundraiser. And I have to say this, and some people have contacted me and have suggested to me, and it's a fair point, that perhaps what Biden was doing or trying to do, or some people in the administration were trying to do by ventilating these comments, is that they were trying to find some way of getting out of this deepening hole. After all, Biden was talking about the need to find some kind of off-ramp, even if he was attributing the need for that off-ramp to Putin himself. But perhaps this is Biden just projecting onto Putin what he himself, the Western powers, actually need. It is they who need the off-ramp more than Putin does, because of this cascade of problems which this Guardian or Observer editorial has outlined, I think, in a fairly clear way. So maybe that's what this is all about. And it is, of course, the case that US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is now also talking about the need to find some kind of diplomatic solution. But against that, if that is the thinking in Washington, there's absolutely no sign so far of any real steps being taken to seek that solution, to perhaps engage with the Russians to find out whether the Istanbul proposals are still on the table, perhaps, possibly. They're not, by the way, I'm pretty sure. But anyway, to find some way out of this thing, maybe a pullback by Ukraine from Donbass and from all the other 4 regions in return for a ceasefire of some kind and some kind of freezing of the conflict. That might be at least a realistic way forward. It wouldn't be a complete solution to the problem, to the crisis, but at least it might be something to start seriously discussing with the Russians at this time. Anyway, no sign, no indication of anything like that. And as we see, the Guardian, and to the best of my knowledge, the British government, their solution still is trying to achieve regime change in Moscow. Now, let's switch emphasis. Let's look at what's actually happening in Ukraine itself, or at least on the battlefields. I say Ukraine, though, of course, from a Russian point of view, much of the fighting now is on Russian territory. And what is actually happening there? Well, much more information gradually trickling through of continuing significant advances by the Russian or pro-Russian forces, the Wagner organization, the Donbass militia in the 2 crucial battlefronts of Bakhmut city and of Donetsk city. And there's again rumours, and they're only rumours that cannot be corroborated, that Ukrainian officials have now been warning people in Bakhmut city to prepare for an evacuation, suggesting that there's now growing belief within the Ukrainian military, perhaps even civilian authorities, that Bakhmut city may be shortly going to fall, which would be, to be very clear, a major event. Elsewhere, there's been little news from what you might call the Northern Front. There's been supposedly a build-up of Ukrainian forces in and around Liman, as I will now again call it, the town of Krasny Liman, which Ukraine captured about 10 days ago, and supposedly there's a build-up there with a plan to push on to capture another small town called Svatovo, which supposedly is an important transport and logistics hub for the Russian military. But there's been actually very little in the way of any actual military movements in and around in this area. To the extent that there has been, I should say that it seems that Ukraine hasn't been gaining a great deal of ground. Now, there was also a lot of reports yesterday about fighting in northern Kherson region, in this area around the Ingulets River, south of the Ingulets River, an area of around 34, it's 34 square kilometers each side. I'm not going to say, 30. It's a box where 34 kilometers on the one and 34 kilometers on the other. I'm not going to try and say how many square kilometers is. Mathematics was never my strength. But anyway, this area where the Ukrainians managed to achieve an advance about a week ago. And again, there were some Ukrainian attacks and they've been repulsed. Now, there was a report on some Russian channels that one of those attacks was apparently quite big, and supposedly 25 Ukrainian tanks were destroyed. And that's true. That was a major battle. I mean, a battle in this kind of war where 25 tanks are destroyed in a single day is a big battle. And if anything like that happened, then Ukraine must have suffered a very serious defeat indeed. I say that because the size of the total Ukrainian tank force is very generously estimated by some people at around 400. So 25 tanks out of 400 is a significant part of the total tank fleet. My own guess, by the way, is it's substantially less than that. I'm going to say straight away that I'm skeptical about that report. I doubt that that number of tanks were indeed destroyed. Ukrainian tanks were indeed destroyed in that battle. But there was one very interesting fact about this battle, something new, which is that for the first time, there were reports that Russian tanks were engaged and that some of the fighting was a tank versus tank battle, which the Russians supposedly won. And in fact, there's been talk about some Russian tank men getting decorations after this fight. Now, what makes this interesting is that it suggests that Russian armored units are being deployed to this area. Now, earlier, when the fighting was along the Ingulets River, at places like Andrievka, Davidov Brod, and other places along the Ingulets River, it seemed to me that the Russian defenders were a thin and fairly light screen of paratroopers, airborne troops, backed by artillery and aircraft and helicopters. In other words, there wasn't any Russian armor deployed in this area. There might have been armor deployed elsewhere, further west, repelling Ukrainian attacks from Nikolaev. But in this particular area, in northern Kherson region, south of the Ingulets River, it was all largely paratroopers, airborne troops, who are essentially light infantry, even though Russian paratroopers do use armored vehicles on a bigger scale than Western paratroopers do. So it doesn't seem as if Russian armor is now being deployed in Kherson region, in this part of Kherson region. And if you recall my previous video, if you watched my previous video, you will also know that in one of these battles in this same area, it looked as if, in fact, it was confirmed that Chechen troops were also involved on the Russian side. So it does seem as if the Russian lines in this area of the conflict have thickened. They've been thickened with reinforcements, some of these being Chechen units, and some of these being armored units as well. Now, I'm not obviously able to discuss the numbers, and I have no way, in fact, of establishing what the numbers on either side are in this field. I do think that this is an interesting fact. It suggests that the defences here are no longer just the paratroopers who were positioned around the Ingulets River. They've been reinforced, perhaps quite heavily reinforced, by other troops. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about this. I'm going to now return to the topic of General Surovikin and his appointment as the overall commander of Russian forces participating in this war. And it's now indisputable because General Surovikin's appointment has now been confirmed by the official news agency, by TASS. They've confirmed that he's been appointed by the Defense Ministry as the overall commander. Now, there's a number of points to make here. Firstly, he is the first commander, the first person to actually have direct command of all of the troops participating in this war. I'd assumed right at the start that there must be such a person, but it turned out I was wrong. And at one point, the British Ministry of Defence was claiming that a commander had been appointed, and he was supposedly General Dvornikov, who was, I believe, the commander of the Southern Military District, except, of course, that it wasn't true. General Dvornikov was not appointed to this post, and the British Defence Ministry incredibly gave wrong information about General Dvornikov's appointment, which begs again the question of what kind of actual information does it have about the Russian command structure in this war. Anyway, up to this point, up to this appointment, it seems that all the coordination up to this time was being carried out by the General Staff in Moscow, headed by General Gerasimov, the chief of the Russian General Staff. And that, on the face of it, seems extremely surprising, at least to me. You would have thought that the chief of the Russian General Staff has a lot of other things to take care of. After all, he's supervising the entire Russian armed forces in every part of Russia, which is a huge country. And one wonders how he would have found the time to focus with laser attention on the fighting in Ukraine. But anyway, that was the position until now. Why it was so, I don't have a simple answer to. There may be many explanations, bureaucratic inertia being one. But anyway, someone in Moscow has now taken the decision that a single commander, General Surovikin, needs to be put in overall control. And General Surovikin has now, as I said, been appointed to that post. And he's apparently establishing a headquarters. And we've seen that he's already starting to put his own people in charge of the various battlefronts. And I would say that his appointment has been extremely well received by and large. I mean, people like Prigozhin and Kadyrov and others have welcomed Surovikin's appointment. They all say that they know him well, that they think he's an extremely capable commander, that they think he's the right man for the job. The only dissent I've seen is from the Russian blogger Igor Girkin, who is one of the who was the commander of the Donetsk militia back in 2014, and he has pointed out that Surovikin does have a rather curious history and has faced in the past corruption allegations and even of arms trafficking when in Central Asia. And he does seem to raise the questions of whether, in fact, that does make Surovikin a suitable person for this role. Now, I know absolutely nothing about General Surovikin. Until a few weeks ago, I never heard of him. So I'm not in any position to discuss his abilities or lack of them. I'm just going to make a number of observations, and they're just pure observations. The first is one that I've long come to the opinion about in any discussion of Russian matters and indeed of Eastern European matters, which is that corruption allegations are often made in this part of the world without much foundation, mainly as a mechanism of political and even bureaucratic struggle. The fact that General Surovikin has in the past been the target of allegations of this kind, and even apparently a decision of disciplinary tribunal which went against him, might not mean that he is actually corrupt. It might mean simply that he has enemies or rivals within the military leadership. One mustn't perhaps take these things entirely seriously. This is particularly common 10, 20 years ago. It's become much less common today, but one should take these allegations of corruption with a certain pinch of salt and perhaps not be too hasty to judge people on the basis of them. The second point is one which I'm afraid is going to sound a rather worldly and cynical one, but which is based on experience. And that is that somebody might be corrupt up to a point. They might be willing to engage in some degree of illicit activity. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not extremely capable and very clever and have a great deal of drive and might be a very competent military leader. One would like to believe that integrity, personal integrity, is the same as ability, leads to ability and success. My own experience, and I know of what I speak, and historical experience, unfortunately, tells another story. So it may be that General Surovikin has done some things in his past which one would not approve of. That may not mean that he's not going to be a very competent area commander. Certainly people like Kadyrov and Prigozhin and others who worked with Surovikin appear to have a very high opinion of his professional abilities. The third thing I'm going to say is that there seems to be a misunderstanding as to his background. He's been in charge of the Russian aerospace forces, and there's been some suggestion that that means that he's an Air Force officer, and that makes him unsuitable for commanding ground troops. The Russian Air Force is part of a larger organization called the Russian Aerospace Forces, which includes many component parts. It includes aviation, obviously. It includes anti-aircraft missiles. It includes space troops, it includes lots of things. It doesn't follow, and in fact, in Surovikin's case, it is not the case that he is, by background, an Air Force officer. In fact, he trained in the Omsk Military Academy, which is a ground forces school. He was, in fact, for most of his time, apparently an infantry officer. He was in one of the units based in Moscow in August 1991, when the coup attempt against Mikhail Gorbachev, the last Soviet president, took place. And he apparently was in command of one of those units at that time. That he can't have been a very senior officer at that time, probably a captain or something like that. But anyway, he received an order from the junta, or the political grouping that tried to overthrow Gorbachev, which included Russia's the Soviet Union's defense minister, Dmitry Yazov. He received an order to take his troops to storm the Russian parliament, where Boris Yeltsin and his flock of liberals were ensconced. And apparently Surovikin did actually accept that order and was prepared to fulfill it. But the point anyway is, whatever view you may take about that, he was at that time an officer in the ground forces. He does have ground forces experience, even if recently he is somebody who's worked in the aerospace forces. And apparently he was the overall commander in Syria of the Russian military forces in Syria, and it was during his watch that the major advances of the Syrian army, backed by the Russian military, took place, and when the grip of various jihadi organizations in Syria was actually broken, and it was widely believed that he did a very good and effective job there. And in fact, apparently, he's something of a military, as well as being an active soldier, he's been apparently something of a military theorist, and he's seen as a combined arms specialist, somebody who has an intimate knowledge of how to bring the various parts of the armed forces and get them all working together as a single team. And I suspect it's that quality, the fact that he is a combined arms specialist, that he knows the army, he knows the ground troops because he was part of them, he knows the aerospace forces because he commanded them. It's this quality that has determined, to a great extent, the choice of him as the overall commander of the Russian forces in Ukraine. And I'm going to make a further guess. Obviously, his immediate job is to bring the Ukrainian offensive under control, to make sure that there aren't any further big advances by Ukraine. And perhaps this stiffening, this hardening up of the front lines, the defense lines that we've been seeing in Kherson region and in other places, maybe that's a reflection of decisions which he is already taking. But I do wonder whether the real reason for his appointment is because, with this big mobilization that is coming, with apparently a Russian decision taken some time ago to change the character of the war, to move perhaps back to offensive operations, to carry out, in other words, a much more extensive war than the one we've seen up to now, to move beyond the very limited parameters of the special military operation as it was created way back in February, whether the decision has been made that this requires someone on the spot with a degree of understanding and knowledge and expertise, and also possesses the drive and the trust of key players, who is able to command and coordinate this complex movement of forces on the battlefield in order to see that this bigger offensive, which is presumably being planned, is brought to a successful conclusion. And if that's the case, then on paper, and again I stress I know nothing about General Surovikin and his personal qualities, perhaps on paper he does look like the kind of man, the kind of commander who would fulfill that role. Now, Surovikin's appointment has come following weeks of increasing, growing criticism of the Russian military leadership, of people like Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister, of General Gerasimov, the chief of the general staff. There's lots of rumors that Shoigu and Gerasimov are going to be dismissed from their posts or made to resign or reassigned to other duties. The suggestions that Surovikin might eventually take over as chief of the general staff. There's been a suggestion that the governor of Tula region, a man called Duran, is being prepared, is being slated to take over as defense minister from Shoigu. I've noticed that even the Institute for the Study of War seems to be picking up on these rumors and is now regurgitating them without perhaps quite acknowledging the fact that they're coming from the Russian blogging and media community. Well, I have no knowledge of any of that. It may be that all these rumors are correct. There have been lots of rumors like that about Shoigu in particular being on the brink of dismissal for months. We'll see whether that is really so. No doubt much will be revealed over the next few days and weeks, and there was confirmation earlier today that President Putin will be having what's called an operational meeting, whatever that means, with his Security Council in Moscow, and no doubt things are going to be discussed there. And if there's any decision to dismiss or reassign anybody, well, who knows, it might come out of that meeting. As I said, I'm not going to comment upon these rumours, but all I would say is that if a decision has been made to upgrade what is still, astonishingly, the special military operation, to move to a much more dynamic and active war once all of these reserves are brought into action, then General Surovikin's appointment does make sense based on what we know of his background to coordinate and command all these much bigger forces that we're going to see. And perhaps that's reason enough for his appointment. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say at the moment. That's almost an hour that you've heard me talking today, and I think I'm going to try and limit it to this. I've covered a great deal of ground about the Crimean Bridge, about Western media coverage, about the lack of any diplomatic efforts to solve the problems created by the war, even though these are now being admitted, even in places like The Guardian. And I think I've said enough about General Surovikin, about whom, as I've said, until a few weeks ago, I knew nothing. So thank you for joining me again today. There'll be more programs from me very soon, obviously, bringing more up to date with developments. As I said, there might be very many developments over the next few hours. It may be that things on the battlefields will again change by the time this program is broadcast. But, I can only do what I can do. In the meantime, please remember, you can find me and also our main channel, the Duran, on our other platforms, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Telegram, and we're also, by the way, now on Rofkin. And remember, if you want to catch up with me, if you want to ask me questions directly, I do live streams exclusively on Locals every Wednesday at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time and 1900 hours London time. And also, if you want to support our work, remember, you can do it through Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. And last but not least, please remember that you can go to our shop. You can buy the amazing things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, our hoodies, many other great things. And you can also, if you want, tick the like button to this video if you've liked this video, and please do check your subscription to this channel. Well, that's me for the day. More from me soon, and have a very good day until then.